طبعا التوصية كانت واضحة، هي تقديم المسؤولين عن الانتهاكات، تقديم المسؤولين المقصود من أمروا بتنفيذ عمليات القتل خارج القانون وبالتعذيب في السجون، ولكن التفت الدولة على هذه التوصية وقدمت مثل ما قلنا مجموعة.
The essence of that recommendation was not only to hold police officers accountable, but to hold accountable those who were giving the orders and overseeing these violations take place. But unfortunately, as he already mentioned, that wasn't done. And the few who were taken to court, more or less, were either acquitted or found innocent.
كمان هناك توصية أخرى تتعلق بتشكيل وحدة مستقلة لمتابعة كل شكاوى التعذيب. فالدولة أيضا أخذت بعين الاعتبار هذه التوصية بشكل مغاير تماما لما توصل إليه بسيوني.
One of the things that was recommended as well was having the public prosecution actually form a unit that would have to look into the torture cases and torture case allegations.
طبعا التوصية كانت تتعلق بأن يعهد إلى مهمة التحقيق في شكاوى التعذيب إلى النيابة العامة في قضايا عديدة. طبعا النيابة العامة شكلت وحدة على أساس متابعة منتهكي حقوق الإنسان والتعذيب خصوصا، ولكن للأسف الشديد هي النيابة العامة من تقدم يعني أطراف النزاع إلى المحكمة باعترافاتهم عن التعذيب، فأصبحت النيابة يعني بشكل أو بآخر هي جزء من عملية تقديم الأدلة لمصلحة الدولة أو الادعاء.
What the public prosecution then did is they actually did form a unit that was supposed to look into allegations of torture, but the conflict of interest and where the problem lies is that the very same unit or the very same public prosecution that is supposed to look into the allegations of torture and investigate are the same people who are using the confessions that were extracted under torture to bring people into court and to try them, and they use it as evidence, and so there's a huge conflict of interest.
طبعا النيابة تعمد إلى تقديم بينات مثل ما يعني احنا اشتغلنا في المحاكم، بينات ضعيفة بحيث ان المحكمة تتوصل إلى نتائج بأن الدعوة يعني قليلة خلينا نقول الأدلة مما يسمح للمحكمة بأن تأخذ جانب البراءة بدلا من الإدانة.
So what we've been trying to do is to present evidence to the courts in the cases to show that there isn't actually enough evidence to hold these people in prison or to convict them according to the charges presented. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to restrict with time, especially since you obviously with the translation had to cut your intervention even shorter, but we'll have questions as well, which in which maybe some of those issues can be looked at more in detail. Mariam.
I'm not going to even attempt to go into all of the violations that we have in Bahrain because there's definitely not enough time for that. But I do invite you all to come tonight to the event where we're actually releasing our report called Promises of Progress, a Worsening Reality, which actually will delve into all of the violations and the entire human rights situation in Bahrain since the BICI report was released. And as you can see, it's quite a large report. Very quickly, to speak about, first of all, freedom of speech. We've had recently 4 cases where people were arrested and imprisoned between 1 month and 6 months on charges of defaming the king on Twitter. Now, what the government of Bahrain is trying to do is they're trying to set a red line for everyone. And it's not just people in the opposition, but even people who are pro-government. And so you'll have people from the opposition who were arrested for saying things about the king on Twitter. But then you also had, for example, one of these cases who was someone who was pro-government who was talking against the king for not doing enough against the protesters. And they considered this defamation as well, which is a breach of freedom of expression. And so these are 4 cases where we've seen people actually, because of using Twitter as a tool for freedom of expression, get arrested and imprisoned. Nabil Rajab, for example, the president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, who's currently sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for what they call illegally protesting, was also imprisoned for about 2 months for one tweet that he wrote criticizing the Prime Minister of Bahrain. So again, these are very, very simple examples of how even social media could be the difference between whether you're behind bars or not in Bahrain. The second thing that I would like to very quickly speak about is the systematic attacks on human rights defenders. We've seen more often than not in Bahrain that human rights defenders are systematically attacked, harassed, targeted. They're either imprisoned, tortured, sentenced to life sometimes, beaten on the streets, shot at close range, and then we have issues of reprisals. Human rights defenders who travel to Geneva and take part in the United Nations usually have to pay a price for it. My colleague Said Youssef, who's sitting in the room today, for example, took part in the last UN Human Rights Council session, and after we released a report holding the King of Bahrain accountable for the culture of impunity in the country, he was arrested, kept in prison for almost 2 weeks, and he was questioned about his involvement in the speech that he gave at the Human Rights Council. So there's actually a very direct link. Hamad al-Masqati, for example, who's the president of the Bahraini Society for Human Rights, after going to Geneva and presenting or giving a speech at the Human Rights Council, received more than a dozen phone calls threatening him with his life and his family's safety just for participating at the Human Rights Council. So this is something that's been ongoing. We have Abdelhadi al-Khwaja, for example, who was arrested last year. One of the severest cases of torture that was documented actually in the BICI report. All of the charges against him are charges of freedom of expression. He's still in prison today under life sentence. And so, as I said, we're seeing this very, very systematic attack against human rights defenders in Bahrain. Going on to the next thing, accountability. I mentioned yesterday when I was talking about the issue of accountability is the idea that we have two kinds of impunity when it comes to Bahrain. We have local impunity that's carried out by the government itself, where if you are a part of the government, especially in high positions, you will not be held accountable. And that is why, as the example I gave yesterday, the king's son felt very comfortable introducing himself to his victims, although they were blindfolded according to their testimonies, because he knew he would not be held accountable for it. In our report that we did on accountability, we found that 9 members of the royal family were involved in many violations and should be held accountable and taken to trial. Some of these members of the royal family are ministers. For example, you have Marshal Khalifa bin Ahmed, who's the head of the Bahrain Defense Force. You have Nasser bin Hamad, who's the king's son. You have Khalid bin Hamad al Khalifa, who's also the king's son. The list goes on, and I'm not going to mention all of them. But because of this culture of impunity, we're not going to see a change happen in Bahrain. This is one of the problems. Unless you start holding people accountable within the system itself, the system is not going to change. Internationally, the Bahraini government has come to a sort of realization, and I think the most troublesome part is that they're quite correct in their realization, which is that they have international immunity. The way other countries have been held accountable for human rights violations, we have not seen it done in Bahrain. Even the least, when we're talking about, for example, doing a joint statement under Item 4 at the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. 27 different countries signed on to that. The United States and the United Kingdom, who are the closest allies to Bahrain, chose not to. And this is sending a very bad message to not only Bahrain, but to the Middle East and North Africa region, which is that if you are a Western ally, then you're immune. You can commit human rights violations and get away with it. If you're not a Western ally, then you will be held accountable for your human rights violations. And I think that this is a very, very dangerous message to send. Human rights are for everyone, and everyone needs to be held accountable. To very quickly round up with the recommendations, I have a few, or some of us have a few recommendations that we wanted to put out today, that we think if we're able to get these things done, we can see Bahrain move forward. One is bringing Bahrain's case to the Human Rights Council special session. Many other countries in the so-called Arab Spring, or countries that witnessed mass protests the way Bahrain did, they had special sessions on them. Bahrain is one of the few countries that didn't. And I think, having a special session right now is important because the Bahraini government has been making a lot of promises, but then failing to actually implement. And there needs to be a sense where the Bahraini government starts to feel that, oh, maybe we will be held accountable for not doing anything and for the human rights situation actually getting worse. To open an office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Bahrain with full mandates. This is something that's been an ongoing discussion between the OHCHR and the Bahraini government. The Bahraini government has not agreed to give them full mandate yet, and that's why it hasn't happened. So pressure to get that done is very important. Allow access to all special rapporteurs. According to my understanding, most, if not all, special rapporteurs have made requests to go to Bahrain. One of them was given permission, and then at the very last minute it was delayed, knowing that he would not be able to come at a later time, and that's why it was delayed at last minute. And that was the special rapporteur on torture. So putting pressure on Bahrain to accept visits from special rapporteurs is very, very important. Ratification of the ICC, signing on to the Rome Statute, allowing access to international NGOs and journalists. International NGOs and journalists are still not being allowed access into Bahrain. Very few are sometimes, and on very exceptional times. They're usually not allowed to stay the weekend, especially on Fridays. And so that's one other thing. Very quickly through the rest. Two more. International accountability. And I think one of the important ways to have international accountability is through diplomatic sanctions. We have a list of names of people who, through the BICI report, are very much involved in the violations that took place over the past year and a half. They're very easy to identify. All that needs to be done is issue a list of these names and say, well, these people will no longer have visas, and these people will have their bank accounts, for example, frozen on the outside. Something like that could make a huge difference. And last but not least, cease of all arms sales to Bahrain and surveillance technology. Arms sales is making the hardliners within the Bahraini government even more hardline because they feel like they're being awarded for what they're doing in Bahrain. And surveillance technology is something that's being sold by European companies to Bahrain, and they're using it to go after human rights defenders and activists. And that needs to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for that. Last speaker on the panel, Liz Evanson.
Human Rights Watch.
Thank you very much, and thank you to No Peace Without Justice for inviting me to be on this panel, and it's really an honor for me to be here with these human rights defenders. I'm a Senior International Justice Counsel at Human Rights Watch, and I'm just going to share some observations based on the reporting and research of my colleagues at Human Rights Watch on Bahrain. Most of what I have to say will echo what's already been said, so I think I'll just try to bring together some of the main themes and main concerns that we have. Of course, the occasion for this press conference is the first anniversary of the BICI report, and as others have already said, that report concluded that in February and March of 2011, security forces had used excessive force against peaceful protesters and had arbitrarily arrested, tortured, and ill-treated them, and also denied them fair trials. It's also already been said that the BICI proposed very important recommendations to redress these violations. And in the time since the BICI report was released, authorities have investigated some low-ranking security officials in connection with torture allegations, but the government has failed to fully implement the Commission's core recommendations. And at the heart of these recommendations were the release of protest leaders convicted for exercising their right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, and also, very importantly, the investigation of high-ranking officials responsible for abuses. I'll come back at the end to this issue of accountability and the failure to investigate and prosecute high-ranking officials, but I just wanted to say a few words about the human rights violations that have continued to occur over the past year in the absence of any real accountability. And I think this is very consistent with the themes that have been brought out, that the BICI report is not the end of the story of what's been happening in Bahrain, and that the failure to implement those recommendations and the failure to have justice and accountability is contributing to continued human rights violations. I'll just mention two pressing issues, again, both of which have already been mentioned. The continued excessive use of force to disperse anti-government protests, and then the prosecution of government critics and human rights defenders.